What happens when a late-night host pushes too far and a royal guest decides enough is enough? Tonight we're diving into one of the most shocking moments in television history, when Prince Harry walked off Stephen Colbert's show after an argument. That left the audience speechless, and the host scrambling to salvage what was left of his reputation. This isn't just another celebrity interview gone wrong. This is a masterclass in how not to treat your guests, and the consequences that follow when arrogance meets dignity. Before we get into this incredible story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments what you think about hosts who cross the line with their guests. Now let's get into what really happened that night. The Late Show with Stephen Colbert was buzzing with anticipation. Prince Harry had agreed to appear on the show to discuss his charitable work and recent initiatives, something that should have been a straightforward, respectful conversation. The audience was packed with fans eager to hear from the Duke of Sussex, and the production team had spent weeks preparing for what they hoped would be a memorable interview. Stephen Colbert walked onto the stage with his usual swagger, but there was something different in his demeanor that night. Perhaps it was the pressure of having such a high-profile guest, or maybe it was his recent ratings struggles, but those close to the production noticed he seemed more aggressive than usual. During the pre-show meetings, his producers had briefed him extensively about the topics that were off-limits, the respectful tone expected when interviewing a member of the royal family, and the importance of maintaining the dignity that such an interview required. As Prince Harry was introduced and walked onto the stage, the audience erupted in applause. He looked composed and ready for what he assumed would be a professional conversation about his work and passions. The initial handshake between the two men seemed cordial enough, but experienced television watchers might have noticed the slightly forced smile on Colbert's face and the way he held the handshake just a moment too long, as if asserting some kind of dominance. The interview began pleasantly enough, with Colbert asking about Prince Harry's recent charitable initiatives and his work with veterans. The Duke responded thoughtfully, sharing stories about the people he had met and the causes that meant the most to him. The audience was engaged, nodding along as he spoke about the importance of mental health awareness and supporting those who had served their countries. But then something shifted. Perhaps it was Colbert's competitive nature, or maybe he felt the need to prove himself in front of his audience, but his questions began to take on a more challenging tone. What started as professional curiosity slowly morphed into something that felt more like an interrogation than an interview. The first sign of trouble came when Colbert interrupted Prince Harry mid-sentence while he was discussing a particularly meaningful encounter with a veteran struggling with PTSD. The host's interruption wasn't just rude, it was completely unnecessary, cutting off what was clearly an important and heartfelt story that the audience was genuinely interested in hearing. Prince Harry paused, visibly taken aback by the interruption, but maintained his composure. He politely attempted to finish his thought, but Colbert had already moved on to his next question, dismissing the veteran's story as if it were irrelevant. The audience shifted uncomfortably in their seats, sensing that something was off about the dynamic between the two men. The questions became increasingly personal and invasive, touching on topics that had clearly been marked as off-limits during the pre-production meetings. Colbert seemed to be testing boundaries, pushing to see how far he could go before his guest would push back. It was as if he was treating the interview like a game, with Prince Harry as an unwilling participant in his power play. When Prince Harry attempted to redirect the conversation back to his charitable work, Colbert made a dismissive comment about royal privilege and questioned whether someone born into wealth could truly understand the struggles of ordinary people. The comment was not only inappropriate, but demonstrated a fundamental misunderstanding of the guest's actual experiences and the work he had been doing for years. The tension in the studio was palpable. Audience members later described feeling uncomfortable, as if they were witnessing something they shouldn't be seeing. The cameras captured every moment of the increasingly strained interaction, including the subtle changes in Prince Harry's body language as he began to realize that this wasn't going to be the respectful interview he had been promised. Colbert's attacks became more pointed and personal. He questioned Prince Harry's motives for leaving royal duties, suggesting that it was all about money and celebrity, rather than the genuine concerns that had been publicly documented. He made snide remarks about family relationships and seemed to take pleasure in watching his guests' discomfort grow. What made the situation even more problematic was Colbert's complete disregard for basic interview etiquette. He continued interrupting, talking over his guest, and treating the conversation like a debate rather than an interview. It was clear that he was more interested in scoring points with his audience than having a meaningful conversation with someone who had important things to share. Prince Harry's patience was wearing thin, but he continued to handle the situation with remarkable grace. He attempted several times to steer the conversation back to substantive topics, sharing insights about his military service and the importance of supporting veterans and their families. Each time, Colbert either dismissed these contributions or twisted them into something negative. The breaking point was approaching, and anyone watching could sense that this interview was heading toward disaster. The host's behavior was becoming increasingly erratic and disrespectful, while his guest maintained a dignity that made the contrast even more stark. The audience could see exactly what was happening, and they weren't impressed with their host's performance. The moment that would define the entire interview came when Colbert decided to bring up Prince Harry's family relationships in the most insensitive way possible. Instead of asking respectful questions about reconciliation or healing, he made a joke that crossed every line of decency and professionalism. The comment was so inappropriate that several audience members audibly gasped, and you could see the shock register on Prince Harry's face. What Colbert said next would be remembered as one of the most tone-deaf moments in late-night television history. He suggested that Prince Harry's concerns about media intrusion and family privacy were hypocritical, given that he had written a book and done interviews. But the way he phrased it was deliberately cruel, mocking the very real trauma that had shaped Prince Harry's life and his reasons for speaking out in the first place. Prince Harry's composure finally cracked, not in anger, but in disbelief at what he was hearing. He leaned forward in his chair and asked Colbert if he truly understood what he was saying, if he grasped the impact of his words not just on him personally, but on the important causes they should have been discussing. It was a moment of genuine vulnerability, a plea for basic human decency that should have prompted any reasonable host to pause and reconsider their approach. Instead, Colbert doubled down. He made another joke, this time about Prince Harry being too sensitive, suggesting that if he couldn't handle tough questions, maybe he shouldn't be doing interviews at all. The comment revealed everything wrong with Colbert's approach to the interview. He had confused cruelty with toughness, disrespect with journalism, and entertainment with genuine conversation. The audience was no longer just uncomfortable. They were witnessing something that felt deeply wrong. Several people in the front rows could be seen shaking their heads, and the usual laughter and applause that punctuated Colbert's show was notably absent. Even his most loyal fans seemed to recognize that their host had crossed a line that should never have been approached, let alone crossed. Prince Harry took a deep breath and made one final attempt to salvage the interview. He spoke directly to Colbert, explaining that he had come on the show in good faith to discuss important issues that affected real people. He mentioned the veterans who were watching, the families dealing with mental health challenges, and the young people who looked up to both of them as public figures. He asked if they could please focus on these meaningful topics instead of personal attacks. It was a masterful display of grace under pressure, the kind of response that demonstrated exactly why Prince Harry had earned respect around the world for his humanitarian work. He wasn't asking for special treatment or avoiding difficult topics. He was simply requesting the basic respect that any guest should expect when appearing on a major television program. Colbert's response was the moment that sealed his fate as the villain of this encounter. Instead of acknowledging his guest's reasonable request, he made a snide comment about being lectured by royalty. He suggested that Prince Harry was trying to control the interview and accused him of not being able to handle real journalism. It was a breathtaking display of arrogance and unprofessionalism that left everyone watching stunned. The irony of Colbert's accusations was lost on him, but crystal clear to everyone else. Prince Harry had spent years dealing with intense media scrutiny, had served in combat zones where real journalists risked their lives for important stories, and had consistently shown up for interviews even when he knew he would face difficult questions. The suggestion that he couldn't handle journalism was not only false, but revealed how little Colbert understood about his guest's actual experiences. What happened next was the moment that defined Prince Harry's character and exposed Colbert's complete lack of professionalism. Instead of responding with anger or matching Colbert's hostile tone, Prince Harry did something that caught everyone off guard. He stood up calmly, looked directly at his host, and delivered a response that was both dignified and devastating. He thanked Colbert for having him on the show, but explained that he had been invited to discuss important issues that could help people, not to be the target of personal attacks disguised as entertainment. He pointed out that there were millions of people watching who deserved better than what they were witnessing, and that using his platform to mock serious issues was a disservice to everyone involved. The silence in the studio was deafening. Prince Harry's words hung in the air like an indictment of everything that had gone wrong with the interview. Colbert, for perhaps the first time in the entire encounter, seemed to realize that he had made a serious mistake. But instead of apologizing or attempting to make things right, he made one final error in judgment that would ensure this interview would be remembered for all the wrong reasons. Colbert tried to make light of the situation, suggesting that Prince Harry was being dramatic and that this was all just part of the fun of late-night television. He encouraged him to sit back down and promised they could talk about charity work, but his tone made it clear that he still didn't understand the gravity of what had happened or the impact of his behavior. Prince Harry's response was swift and final. He removed his microphone, placed it carefully on the chair, and walked toward the edge of the stage. The cameras captured every step as he moved with quiet dignity toward the exit, his decision made, and his message clear. This wasn't a tantrum or an emotional outburst. It was a principled stand against behavior that had no place in professional discourse. The audience didn't know how to react. Some began to applaud Prince Harry as he walked away, recognizing his dignity in an impossible situation. Others sat in stunned silence, trying to process what they had just witnessed. The usual energy of a late-night talk show had been replaced by something much more serious and uncomfortable. Colbert was left standing on his stage, suddenly aware that his audience wasn't with him. The jokes that had seemed clever in his head now felt cruel and unnecessary. The tough questions he thought he was asking had revealed themselves to be nothing more than mean-spirited attacks on someone who had come in good faith to discuss important work. As Prince Harry reached the exit, he paused for just a moment and looked back at the audience. It wasn't a gesture of anger or defiance, but rather one of disappointment that an opportunity to discuss meaningful issues had been wasted on cheap shots and unprofessional behavior. Then he was gone, leaving behind a studio full of people trying to understand what they had just experienced. The studio fell into an eerie silence that seemed to stretch on forever. Colbert stood alone on his stage, looking out at an audience that was no longer laughing with him, but staring at him with expressions ranging from disappointment to outright disapproval. The energy that had filled the room at the beginning of the show had been completely drained by his behavior, replaced by an uncomfortable tension that seemed to settle over everyone present. For the first time in his career, Stephen Colbert appeared, to be genuinely at a loss for words. The man who built his reputation on quick wit and clever comebacks found himself facing a situation that couldn't be fixed with a joke or a sarcastic comment. The gravity of what had just happened was beginning to sink in, and even he seemed to realize that he had crossed lines that should never have been crossed. The audience members closest to the stage could see the confusion and growing panic in Colbert's eyes as he tried to figure out how to salvage what was left of the show. His usual confidence had evaporated, replaced by the dawning realization that he had just created one of the most embarrassing moments in late-night television history. The cameras were still rolling, capturing every awkward second of his struggle to regain control of the situation. Some audience members began to shift in their seats, unsure whether they should stay or leave. The uncomfortable atmosphere in the studio was palpable, and many people later described feeling like they had witnessed something deeply inappropriate that they wished they could unsee. The excitement they had felt about seeing Prince Harry had been replaced by embarrassment and disappointment in their host's behavior. Colbert made a feeble attempt to continue the show, making a weak joke about royal exits and trying to move on to his next segment, as if nothing had happened. But the damage was done, and everyone in the studio knew it. His attempt at humor fell completely flat, met with silence from an audience that was no longer willing to laugh, along with behavior they found unacceptable. The production team behind the cameras was scrambling to figure out how to handle the situation. This wasn't just an awkward moment that could be edited out later. This was a complete disaster that would define how people remembered this episode. The producers who had worked so hard to book Prince Harry as a guest were watching their careful planning crumble in real time. What made the situation even more painful to watch was Colbert's continued inability to recognize the severity of his mistakes. Instead of acknowledging that he had behaved inappropriately toward his guest, he seemed to be doubling down on his approach, suggesting to the audience that Prince Harry had overreacted to what he called normal late-night television banter. This tone-deaf response only made things worse. The audience could see the clear difference between what had happened and normal interview dynamics. They had witnessed personal attacks disguised as questions, disrespect masquerading as journalism, and cruelty presented as entertainment. Colbert's attempt to minimize his behavior only highlighted how little he understood about what had actually taken place. Several audience members began to voice their disapproval more openly. What started as uncomfortable murmurs grew into audible expressions of disappointment. Some people could be heard saying that Prince Harry had been right to leave and that they would have done the same thing in his position. The host was losing his own audience in real time, something that rarely happens in the controlled environment of a television studio. The most damaging aspect of the entire situation was how it revealed the fundamental difference in character between the two men. Prince Harry had maintained his dignity throughout the encounter, consistently trying to redirect the conversation toward meaningful topics and treating even his hostile host with respect. Colbert, on the other hand, had revealed himself to be petty, cruel, and completely lacking in the basic professionalism expected of someone in his position. As the show limped toward its conclusion, Colbert made one final attempt to save face by suggesting that the whole situation had been blown out of proportion. He claimed that he had simply been doing his job as a talk show host, asking the tough questions that his audience expected. But everyone watching knew that what they had witnessed had nothing to do with tough journalism and everything to do with a host who had let his ego and arrogance override his basic decency. The contrast between Colbert's excuses and Prince Harry's principled exit couldn't have been more stark. While the host continued to make light of the situation and avoid taking responsibility for his behavior, Prince Harry had demonstrated exactly the kind of integrity and dignity that had earned him respect around the world. His decision to leave wasn't an act of weakness or oversensitivity. It was a powerful statement about the standards he expected from professional interactions. The audience began to file out of the studio as the show ended, many of them shaking. their heads in disbelief at what they had witnessed. The excitement they had felt about being part of a television taping had been replaced by embarrassment and disappointment. Several people were overheard saying they felt sorry for Prince Harry and ashamed of how he had been treated. The immediate aftermath in the studio revealed just how badly Colbert had misjudged the situation. His own staff members appeared uncomfortable and embarrassed by their host's behavior. The producers who had worked to create a respectful environment for such an important guest were clearly dismayed by how thoroughly their efforts had been undermined. What had started as an opportunity for meaningful conversation about important issues had instead become a masterclass in how not to conduct an interview. Colbert's behavior had not only been unprofessional and disrespectful, it had also been completely counterproductive to the goals of good television. Instead of creating compelling content, he had created an uncomfortable spectacle that reflected poorly on everyone involved. The empty chair where Prince Harry had been sitting served as a powerful symbol of what had been lost. An opportunity to discuss veterans' issues, mental health awareness, and charitable work had been squandered in favor of cheap shots and personal attacks. The causes that could have benefited from the platform and attention were instead overshadowed by one man's inability to conduct himself with basic professionalism. As the studio lights dimmed and the cameras stopped rolling, the full magnitude of what had happened began to settle over everyone present. This wasn't just a bad interview or an awkward moment. It was a complete failure of hospitality, professionalism, and basic human decency. Stephen Colbert had managed to turn what should have been a highlight of his show into one of the most embarrassing moments of his career. The lasting image from that night wasn't of clever jokes or insightful questions, but of a dignified man, walking away from behavior that had no place in civilized discourse. Prince Harry's exit had been more powerful than any words he could have spoken, a silent but unmistakable statement about the standards he expected and the respect he demanded not just for himself, but for the important work he represented. So, what did you think about this incredible display of dignity versus arrogance? Have you ever seen a host so completely misread a situation and destroy their own credibility? Drop your thoughts in the comments below and make sure to subscribe for more stories about the moments when public figures show their true character. What other interview disasters would you like to see covered next?